Hi, this is not your traditional tutorial. This is actually a video about pivot points. Every single object, every single node in 3D is basically a pivot point and then something else, or maybe even nothing. Now, what's the power of pivot points? Because if you understand pivot points, you can actually learn to control them and put their workings to your advantage. Now, let's start with this one. I got a circle here, and obviously this is a 2D primitive, so it's not editable. And the pivot point is in the center because basically the circle is a formula and it needs that center point, that reference point, to calculate where the circle should be. So, for instance, its radius, etc., etc. Now, if I try to go into pivot mode and I try to move the pivot point, it's not possible. That's because it's not editable yet. When you make it editable, and you can do that by pressing C or this icon here up in the left corner, you actually lose all the abilities that you have here. For instance, intermediate points, well, you get that back, I guess, but you can't control the radius or make it into a ring or an ellipse or whatever. So you shouldn't do that on the first go. What you can do is change pivot points of certain other objects. For instance, if I make this into a donut shape and put the circle into the lathe, I should, yep, there it goes. I get this donut shape, excuse me, and I can actually move the pivot point of the lathe, but in this particular case with the lathe, the revolve is actually linked to the position of the pivot point. So if I move this, I actually expand the donut or torus. Now, in other cases, for instance, with the loft, it doesn't really matter, but you should take note when it does matter and what kind of effect it has. Let's give another example. Let's move up here, and here I have a sphere, and I'm trying to move the pivot point. Oh, I got the wrong object. Hang on. Control Z. Here I got a sphere, and I'm moving it out. And here I got the first pivot point, which is an orbit pivot. It's a null node, so there's nothing else but a pivot. And I can actually animate this. Orbit is basically a revolve around the H. So I'm just giving it a keyframe here and moving it up to 75. Make this 360 and give it another keyframe. So now when I put the sphere into the extra pivot point, I get this. And right now I put a tracer on it, so it will actually trace my object. So it's basically a perfect circle. Once I've done that, I can actually do something else with a different pivot point. And I can position that wherever. For instance, well, put it over here. And animate the pitch. Go from 0, yeah, and go to, well, roughly in the middle. And make that like 90. And at the end, put it back to 0. Right, so I got 3 keyframes, different pivot point, and I'll just drop this into that one and see what it does. So now it's making this odd loop. And let's do that again, and this time with the banking. Roll it back and say we start at 90. And we'll just keep the pivot point here. Well, actually, move it down here or down there. and go to the end, and hang on, I should have given it a pivot point keyframe. So here we'll do this, and at the end we'll do -90. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. So what we got here is, and we move this into the pitch, we got 3 layers of animation and the sphere just stuck underneath. And what we get is something like this. It's moving out of frame, it's kind of odd. I actually should have moved it a little bit different. I can actually edit each level of animation and make it more interesting. Okay, now it's just 180 degrees. I can go to the end and do a -360 and give that a keyframe, and I get something completely different, of course. It's looking like a regular spiral, but you catch my drift. You can actually manipulate multiple layers of animation more easily with separate pivot points. Now, the position and rotation axes of the pivot point is important, and this is the last example that I want to give you. This is basically an IKEA setup without bones, but the bones are represented by cubes that I flatten out. And this is already set up previously. And if I grab the end goal of the foot, you can tell that by just manipulating the end point, I can actually make this leg move, like make a step or move back or give a kick, that sort of thing. Now that is all because all the pivot points are exactly where the joints should be. If you don't have that correctly, then it will fail. Basically, your leg will come apart and things will turn different ways that you don't want them to move. So pivot points are extremely important. Pivot mode is right here on the left hand side, and use it, but always remember to turn it off when you're done. And you can layer pivot points to make layers of animation. Sometimes it controls your object's shape. So that's basically what you need to know about pivot points. They're the most important object because they're always part of any object in 3D.